Let me pull a few threads together for you. We're going to start with the Nuremberg trials after World War II. After years spent interviewing and observing some of the most notorious war criminals in history, the army psychologist Gustav Gilbert came to a conclusion about the nature of evil. He said, quote, "I was searching for the nature of evil. I think I've come close to defining it. A lack of empathy. It's the one characteristic that connects all the defendants, a genuine incapacity to feel with their fellow men." End quote. So it's not cruelty, it's not sadism, it's not cartoon villainy, just the inability to see other people as fully human. And there's a strong vein of explicitly anti-empathy sentiment on the far right now. Elon Musk said the fundamental weakness of Western civilization is empathy. He's not the only one. Manosphere influencers often say that reading books is bad because it might inadvertently cause a person to develop empathy, which they have established as a de facto negative thing. There's a growing branch of the religious right that's been preaching the idea that empathy is sinful. So it's not a surprise then that this anti-empathy coalition would come together to help elect one of the least empathetic and most destructive people to ever become president. We're watching Trump's lack of empathy play out in brutal and deadly immigration raids, but also in how he disregards the human beings who inhabit places like Gaza and Greenland. We're watching powerful men who don't see other people as fully human sit in rooms and draw lines on maps. Greenland, Ukraine, Trump's so-called board of peace, the idea that Trump and Putin should probably just be able to sit down at a table and divide Ukraine amongst themselves and call it peace. This is the return of might makes right diplomacy. It's a transactional foreign policy that treats millions of human beings as abstractions, as bargaining chips, as acceptable costs in service of a deal. And if you're wondering what happens when you let leaders who lack empathy draw lines on maps, history has some very clear answers. So we'll start with Iraq. Iraq as a country was essentially assembled by European imperialists who were pursuing their own interests, primarily oil. No surprise there. And of course, they had essentially no regard for whoever the existing ethnic, religious, or tribal communities who actually lived there were. The borders were artificial, but the divisions ended up being baked into that country. So it's not a surprise then that it ended up as an unstable country ruled by a dictator. And then even after the fall of Saddam Hussein's regime, it didn't create stability, obviously. It created a power vacuum that fueled a sectarian civil war between the Shia and the Sunni, divisions that had been embedded in the country's very structure since its creation by foreign powers. Artificial divisions don't create peace. At best, they defer violence, but they embed the causes of future conflict into the very borders being drawn, making that violence all that much more likely. And the people who drew those lines, of course, never experienced the consequences. The partition of India is even more stark. It was, again, the British who drew borders to create India and Pakistan, and what followed was one of the largest forced migrations in human history, somewhere between 15 and 18 million people displaced, and communities that had coexisted next to each other for a long time suddenly turned on each other in what was essentially mutual genocide. The damage persists to this day. India and Pakistan have fought multiple wars since partition. The region remains one of the most dangerous nuclear flashpoints on the planet, and the lines drawn by powerful men in 1947 are still getting people killed in 2026. Now, arguably, the world has done a better job of not creating these kinds of problems for ourselves in the post-imperialism era, where far more states were gaining their independence than coming under imperial rule or being divided up arbitrarily by imperialists. It was during this post-imperial period of decolonization that the US became the global hegemon. So it wasn't because of us that colonial states like India were gaining their independence, but we were instrumental in setting up the world order after World War II in which the period of decolonization could take place. As imperfect as it was, there was an attempt to set rules of the international order that tried to embed ideas like empathy, human rights, and sovereignty into the expectations of how countries would treat each other, explicitly saying that we are no longer going to abide by the idea that might makes right. And what we are seeing is an explicit effort to roll that back, to remove empathy and the humanity of impacted peoples across the world, to make way for old school might makes right, global plutocracy in which those who are already wealthy and powerful become oligarchs who steer the power of the state to further enrich and empower themselves. Now, unsurprisingly, US allies are openly questioning this fraying world order. For years, I've had this little snippet of a conversation stuck in my head in which a journalist describes interviewing a Canadian general, asking, why did Canada join the United States to go into Afghanistan? And the Canadian general flatly said, because we have to pay in blood to maintain the good working economic relationship with the United States. For decades, American allies like Canada have operated under an implicit bargain. Go along to get along. Join American military ventures, support US foreign policy priorities, and in exchange, you get access to American markets, security guarantees, and a seat at the table. Well, that bargain is fraying and fast because transactional relationships offer no security. Today's deal with Trump can be tomorrow's betrayal because everything is negotiable and nothing is principled, and they all know it. So Gilbert observed those Nazi officials at Nuremberg and found that the common thread wasn't some unique monstrousness. It was the combination of empathy deficit with absolute power. And evil can really only manifest itself in action. When leaders who lack empathy also possess unchecked power, the combination is always catastrophic, and not just in the moment, but for decades. This is what allows them to treat other nations' citizens as abstractions, to view international borders as game pieces, and to measure success in transactional wins rather than human outcomes. And importantly, just to reiterate that they are not the ones who will be affected by the consequences of their decisions. It is not the leaders making deals, definitely not the billionaires who profit from the disruption. The Iraq War didn't hurt the defense contractors, and the partition of India didn't hurt the British colonial administrators who went back to London. It is the ordinary people who bear the displacement, the violence, the economic devastation every single time without exception. And so what we are witnessing is the march of global wealth inequality dressed up as foreign policy. We're going back to the might makes right order, which benefits precisely those who are already insulated from its consequences. So Gilbert's definition of evil gives us a word for what we're witnessing. It's not dramatic evil or theatrical evil, just the banal, bureaucratic inability to see other human beings as fully real, elevated to the level of international policy. We know what happens when powerful men carve up nations in rooms. The damage lasts generations, and we're still living with borders drawn a century ago. So, Gilbert spent years searching for the nature of evil, and he found it in the incapacity to feel with fellow human beings. We are watching that incapacity play out in real time in the rhetoric about Greenland, in the proposals for Ukraine, in the tariff threats against allies, and the ICE raids in Minnesota and beyond. The question isn't whether this approach will cause harm. History answers that question definitively. The question is, will we name it for what it is and rally to resist it while we still can?